Game of Thrones is not a political show. It's a show about politics itself. The fantasy elements are almost superfluous. The core of the series is how it tackles different ideas of power and squares them against each other in the brutal arena of Westeros. The series starts off with King Robert Baratheon, an accidental revolutionary. He's an excellent military commander, and ends up taking political control over 7 kingdoms after some personal drama leads him to destroy the old regime. But with no desire or ability to rule, his own death destroys the thin veneer of stability in the kingdom, and a civil war ensues. We are opened up to an array of political actors. House Stark is the most sympathetic, with their strict system based on loyalty and accountability. Their idealism is crushed by the Lannisters' vicious realpolitik. Power is power, and loyalty can be bought. Alongside this main struggle are the minor factions. Peter, Chaos is a ladder Baelish, the paranoid and isolationist Eyrie, the populist religious radicals known as the Sparrows, the anti-government Brotherhood without banners, and so on. Then there's Daenerys, the vengeful survivor of the regime purged by King Robert. Exiled to a foreign continent, she is initially motivated by a sense of entitlement and revenge. But after liberating herself from her cruel brother, she learns that power can be used to free the oppressed. Despite setbacks and threats to her life, Daenerys ends slavery in multiple cities and becomes mother to the downtrodden. Her army is made up of freed slaves who had decided of their own accord to fight for her. Now, this is all very interesting, but it's a little strange that millions of people all over the world would become deeply emotionally invested in a show about fantasy politics to the point that hundreds of mothers actually name their babies Khaleesi after Daenerys' fantasy political title. The show really spoke to people. It did things that nobody thought was possible on television and had a definite impact on world culture. Part of this had to do with sex, violence, and spectacle, but other HBO shows like Rome had these characteristics, were incredibly well written and critically acclaimed, and yet they never reached the pop culture status Game of Thrones did. Game of Thrones inhabited the world spirit of its time in a way perhaps no other show has. Its run lasted from 2011 to 2019, covering the beginning of the Occupy Wall Street protests and most of the Trump presidency. At a time when our political system was openly in crisis, Game of Thrones presented a world that mirrored our own, but from a safe distance. It told a story of a fractured ruling class, too embroiled in their own internal squabbles to care anything about the people, who ultimately suffer the terrible costs of their stupid games. On the horizon looms a threat to humanity's very existence. Instead of doing anything about it, the rulers deny the threat exists and exacerbate internal tensions to the point it destroys society's ability to handle even basic problems. We're left hanging at the edge of our seats, anxious to see if it's even possible to get out of this mess. This is when Game of Thrones became perhaps the most disappointing show in television history. A lot of ink has been spilled on this topic, mostly focusing on terrible story decisions, bad acting, egregious writing, and other mechanical features. This all matters, but I don't think it explains why it felt so utterly devastating when the show ended up dropping the ball. The quality had been declining for seasons, yet viewership continued to increase. There are a number of moments that stand out. The Westerosi mirror for climate change is unceremoniously poofed out of existence by ninja moves and a magical MacGuffin. Daenerys randomly turns crazy, decides to sack the capital city in a portrayal that's visceral and horrific even for a series defined by brutality, and then she turns it to literally Hitler trademark. After she's assassinated by her lover half-brother, the pathetic remains of the ruling class vote to install an all-seeing, unfeeling teenage demigod as king. This new surveillance state is administered by a skeleton crew, including a mercenary who threatened his way into the royal treasury and a college dropout who's now the lead scholar, doctor, historian on the continent. As an audience, I suppose we're expected to be happy our favorite characters made it to the end in a sort of happily ever after. All I can think about is what happens after the camera stops rolling. None of the structural tensions that led to war in the first place have actually been resolved. Either the new king uses the new phony proto-democracy to support a strong and permanent totalitarian state, or the whole thing collapses into a return to petty squabbles between the ruling class and the process starts all over again. The administration is either inexperienced, incompetent, or non-existent, and the whole continent has been basically reduced to rubble by warfare, so we can expect civil unrest and suffering with no end in sight. Good ending. I don't think this is only lazy and stupid. The ending was devastating precisely because there is political messaging behind it. It's pure ideology. Just as the show was a mirror for the problems we face, the ending is a mirror for our lack of any real solution moving forward. Our leaders do not have any answers for climate catastrophe. Even as we continue to exacerbate the situation, we can apparently do nothing but hold out hope that an unexpected technological advancement will swoop in and rescue us from our predicament. Bad actors will use any attempt to solve the problem as a strategic pawn to advance their own political goals, and at best will have intense localized devastation that hopefully hits nameless foreigners first before it kills anyone we really care about. Radical change is not acceptable, no matter how desperate our situation becomes. Any thinking outside of the current political order is considered inherently doomed to carnage matching that of the 20th century socialist and fascist regimes. The show is especially insistent on this point. The voice of reason tells us directly that Daenerys' outburst was inevitable given her history of killing slave masters. This cannot be an admonishment of violence. We just spent the past 7 seasons celebrating violence, and our new finance minister even has a cute speech about how he murdered his way to the top, just like the rest of the political order. What is evil within itself is to imagine a future beyond oppression, existing outside of a political order based on violence. The show puts forward an alternative path, similar to what Dr. Hans-Georg Moeller calls wokeism in our real culture. We get to preserve the old political apparatus, a king ruling over lords, a team of technocrats dictating to the people, and so on. The really important change is who exactly holds power. King Bran the Broken seriously is disabled. There are multiple important female leaders, including the queen of a newly independent kingdom, and the king's council now consists of a dwarf, 2 former peasants, a woman, and a fat bloke. This is the true victory. The status quo is preserved, but it is being managed by people with marginalized identities.
3 great men sit in a room, a king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
Depends on the sellsword.
Does it? He has neither crown nor gold, nor favor with the gods.
He has a sword, the power of life and death.
But if it's swordsmen who rule, why do we pretend kings hold all the power? When Ned Stark lost his head, who was truly responsible? Joffrey, the executioner, or something else?
I've decided I don't like riddles.
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
This quote from Season 2 is perhaps the best in the series. It's as good a thesis as any for early Game of Thrones, which reminds me of Noam Chomsky's famous definition of anarchism. Power needs to be closely scrutinized, and if it fails to prove itself to be legitimate, it ought to be dismantled. The show hones in on how illegitimate power brutalizes people, and the most heroic characters like Arya Stark embody rejection and subversion of this power through their own individual struggles. The ending presents almost the complete opposite idea, which is why it's so terribly dissonant. Game of Thrones is a fictional Tahrir Square moment. Its promise for something beautiful and revolutionary was subverted by a return to business as usual, but worse. It leaves one feeling despondent, as if the world lacks in potential. But within this despondence lies potential itself. If a mirror of our current trajectory leaves us feeling empty and unsatisfied, we must develop a new one. If we cannot trust in our leaders, we must learn to trust ourselves.